Alright, welcome to the video on the respiratory system. We're going to start off with 4 functions of the respiratory system. So its main function, it provides oxygen and removes carbon dioxide, or we could call that gas exchange. It brings in carbon dioxide and gets rid of it brings in oxygen and gets rid of carbon dioxide, which is nice because our cells use that oxygen to make energy, and then they produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct of that, and then our lungs, or our respiratory system, gets rid of it. The second function would be speech. The vocal cords are located in the larynx, and it requires air moving past them to make noise. The next one is smell and taste. So up in the nasal cavity, right up here is where the olfactory epithelium is. That's where we smell, and so we have to breathe in to get those odorants up to this area. And we know that taste requires smell also. And then the fourth function, it helps to regulate acid-base balance. When our carbon dioxide levels get too high, that makes our pH drop, and that's not good for our body. So there are receptors that will detect that, and in response to that, we will increase our breathing rate. That will get rid of the excess carbon dioxide and bring our pH back into homeostasis. Then we need to know the function of several structures. So we'll start with the nasal cavity. It's an air passageway and a filter. It's lined with hair and mucus. You can see here the concha that increase the surface area of this. So if you breathe in any dust or anything, hopefully it gets trapped in that mucus and doesn't go to your lungs. Next is the pharynx, which is a air and a food passageway. Next is the larynx. So below the pharynx, you go to the larynx. It has 3 functions. First, it prevents food and liquid from entering the trachea. So right here's the trachea, and behind that is the esophagus. That's where we want the food and the water to go. In the trachea, we just want air. It's also an air passageway, and it's also responsible for producing sound right in here. Then next we have the epiglottis. So this little flap right here is the epiglottis, and it folds down when we swallow. It covers the trachea when we swallow. That prevents food and liquids from entering the trachea. So it covers the larynx during swallowing. Then the vocal cords are going to produce sound. Then the trachea, move to this one. The trachea is the main airway. And then the bronchi, the trachea comes down and it branches into primary bronchi, and branches off of those are called secondary bronchi, and branches off of those are called tertiary bronchi. And then after that we just call them bronchioles. So bronchioles are the smallest airways, and it branches about 17 times before you get to an alveoli, which are the smallest air sacs. You can see they are surrounded by capillaries. And if we look even closer, we'll see this is the respiratory membrane. This is where gas exchange happens. It's made up of the cells of the capillary and the cells of the alveoli of the lung. They're both simple squamous epithelium, so very thin cells, good for diffusion. So oxygen diffuses into the blood and carbon dioxide diffuses out. Alright, next we need to know about the smoker's cough. If you look at the cells lining the trachea and the bronchi, they have these cilia, and we're going to watch this video that explains what the cilia do.
The air that enters the nose needs to be warmed, moistened, and filtered before it gets to the lungs. This is because air contains suspended matter such as pollen, bacteria, dust, fungal spores, and viruses. The cells lining the respiratory tract play an important role in filtering the air and cleaning the nasal passages. They are of 2 types, ciliated epithelial cells and goblet cells, which secrete mucus.
So you can see the mucus is moved by the cilia up and out of the trachea and into the esophagus. So sometimes it's called the ciliary escalator. So as you breathe in, any dust will get caught in the mucus, and then the cilia, they move together in a wave-like fashion, and they move it up out of the trachea. They'll move it out of the trachea and down the esophagus, and then it goes through your digestive system and out that way. And so if you smoke, it basically paralyzes these cilia, so they can't move, and they can't move that stuff out of your lungs, so then you have to try to cough it out of your lungs. So don't smoke. Alright, next thing is asthma. So the cause is the airways become inflamed when they react to triggers. Those triggers could be something like pollen, cold. My trigger is exercising in the cold. And what happens is the muscles surrounding the airways contract and the bronchioles constrict and spasm. This narrows the airway and causes coughing and wheezing, and it feels like you can't breathe. It's really not fun. It's treated with medicines to relax the airways and reduce inflammation. So what those inhalers do is they allow the smooth muscle around the bronchioles to relax. That opens up the airways and makes it so you can breathe again. It's a very nice feeling to be able to breathe again. You can see on the right side there are 3 lobes of the lungs. On the left side there's only 2 lobes. That's because the heart takes part of that area. And the lungs are surrounded by a pleural cavity. You have the visceral pleura next to the lungs. It's blue in this figure. And then the parietal pleura is on the outside of the thoracic cavity, and in between those is called the pleural cavity. It's filled with fluid, and that allows the lungs to inflate or deflate without causing any friction. We're going to skip the lung microbiota. The pulmonary ventilation. So part of breathing is getting air in and out of the lungs, and the technical term for that is pulmonary ventilation, and it involves both inspiration and expiration. Both of these processes depend on the respiratory muscles and the difference between the air pressure within the lungs and outside the body. So we need to know the muscles that contract during inspiration. So the main breathing muscle is the diaphragm, and it pulls down when it contracts, and then the external intercostals and the internal intercostals. So during normal, quiet breathing, those are the muscles that contract. And then we need to know the muscles for deep inspiration. So if you're taking a really deep breath, you will involve the sternocleidomastoid, the scalenes, and the pectoralis minor. Those are all going to lift up on the chest. They increase the volume of the thoracic cavity, and that makes you breathe in deeper. And then for forced expiration, so normally expiration is a passive process. We just let these muscles relax, and as they relax, the thoracic cavity is going to get smaller. That increases the pressure in the lungs and makes the air flow out. But for forced expiration, like coughing or something, the rectus abdominis is involved, and the external abdominal oblique. They're both involved in that. That will compress your abdomen and force more air out of the lungs. Alright, we need to know the centers that help control breathing. So the inspiratory center is the primary respiratory center. That's what's active during normal, quiet breathing. The apneustic center can increase the length and depth of inspiration. So if we need to change our breathing because we need more oxygen because we're exercising or something, that may become active. The pneumotaxic center prevents lung overinflation, so that keeps us from breathing too much. If we overinflate our lungs, they would pop, and that would not be good. And then the expiratory center is used for forceful exhalations, so like coughing or sneezing, and so that would activate the rectus abdominis and the external abdominal obliques. Next, we have a body at work question. So what causes the respiratory center to override voluntary changes to breathing rate? So we can hold our breath. Say we wanted to swim underwater or something, we can hold our breath. but we can only do it for so long. And the thing that causes the respiratory center to override that is rising carbon dioxide levels. So we might think it's oxygen levels, but it's actually the carbon dioxide. When the carbon dioxide levels increase, that causes lots of problems in our body because it lowers the pH. So carbon dioxide is the strongest thing that controls breathing. Some other factors that influence breathing: oxygen levels. So when oxygen decreases, our breathing rate is going to increase to get more oxygen in. That makes sense to most people. The hydrogen ion level, or the pH. So when the pH goes down, decreases, that's going to increase breathing. Again, if the pH decreases, that means the carbon dioxide levels are high, and so we increase our breathing rate to get rid of the carbon dioxide. The next one is stretch. So when we increase the stretch, we're going to decrease the breathing rate. Again, we don't want to overinflate the lungs. Then pain and emotion can have an effect. So pain increases the respiratory rate, and emotions like fear and anxiety can increase the respiratory rate. Some people use what's called breath work to try to modulate pain or emotion. Google breath work if you want to learn about that. Irritants will cause you to cough or sneeze because we want to get those irritants out of the lungs. Alright, what is the main muscle responsible for pulmonary ventilation? And the correct answer is the diaphragm. Alright, next we need to know the symptoms of emphysema. So with emphysema, one of the main causes of it is cigarette smoking. Air pollution can also do it. The alveolar walls are destroyed, and the alveolar walls, that's where the gas exchange is happening. So if those are destroyed, you can't breathe as well. The alveoli merge to create larger air sacs that are less elastic. This makes it harder to breathe. Your lungs are very elastic, and when they're less elastic, it becomes harder to breathe. Also, the bronchioles narrow and collapse, again making it harder to breathe. And so normally exhalation is a passive process. We just relax our muscles, and because there's elastic tissue in the lungs, they just automatically deflate. But someone with emphysema will have to work to exhale. They have to use their muscles to exhale, so breathing becomes harder, and it causes all sorts of problems. Alright, next we're going to talk about pressure and airflow. So it's atmospheric pressure that drives respiration. That's just the pressure that's in the air all around you. And at sea level, it's 762 millimeters of mercury, and as you get higher up, it goes down slightly. So when the pressure within the lungs drops lower than the atmospheric pressure, air is going to flow into the lungs, and when pressure within the lungs rises above atmospheric pressure, air is going to flow out. And there's a law called Boyle's Law that says the volume and pressure are inversely related. So when we want to breathe in, what we do is we contract our diaphragm. So diaphragm is going to move down. The internal and external intercostal muscles are going to pull the ribs up. That's going to increase the volume of our thoracic cavity, and that's going to cause low pressure inside the lungs. So we increase the volume, the pressure goes down, and when the pressure in the lungs is less than the atmospheric pressure, air is going to enter the lungs. When we want to breathe out, we relax the diaphragm and we relax these muscles. Now the volume of the thoracic cavity decreases. That means the volume of the lungs decreases, and that makes the pressure increase. And when the pressure in the lungs is higher than the atmospheric pressure, air is going to go out. So that's how we breathe in and out. So another review question. When pressure in the lungs drops lower than atmospheric pressure, what occurs? And when pressure in the lungs is lower than atmospheric pressure, air is going to flow into the lungs because air flows from higher to lower pressure. Alright, Alright, some factors that affect airflow. The diameter of the bronchioles, if they're bigger, it's going to be easier for air to flow. Pulmonary compliance, which is basically how stretchy the lungs are. So if they're more elastic, it makes it easier for the airflow. Also, the alveolar surface tension. So the alveoli are coated with water, and because they're so small and water has surface tension, it wants to pull those inward and make them collapse. So we have what's called surfactant that stops that from happening. One problem with premature babies is they don't make surfactant yet, so they have breathing problems. Now we have artificial surfactant we can give them to help with that. So gas exchange depends on differences in pressure, and gas is going to diffuse from higher to lower pressure until those pressures are equalized. So the air we breathe in is about 80% nitrogen and about 20% oxygen and less than 1% carbon dioxide. And so, but each gas in the mixture has a certain pressure called its partial pressure. So we're going to watch this movie that explains this.
The lungs are the site of exchanges of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air and the blood. Oxygen enters the lungs with each inhalation, while carbon dioxide exits the lungs with each exhalation. The exchange of gases occurs in the lungs' millions of tiny air sacs called alveoli. Each alveolus is surrounded by a network of pulmonary capillaries. Semi-permeable membranes line the walls of the alveoli and the walls of the pulmonary capillaries. These permeable membranes allow for diffusion of oxygen gas into the capillary bloodstream and diffusion of carbon dioxide gas out of the pulmonary capillary bloodstream. An inhalation brings a fresh supply of oxygen into the lungs. In contrast, the blood flowing through the lungs has just come from the rest of the body, where it's been depleted of oxygen. Therefore, a higher concentration of oxygen exists inside the alveoli, and a lower concentration of oxygen exists within the bloodstream. The concentration of a gas is expressed in terms of its pressure. The units used are millimeters of mercury, or millimeters Hg. The pressure of oxygen is expressed as PO2. After inhalation, inside the alveoli, the PO2 is approximately 100 millimeters mercury. This high concentration of oxygen inside the alveoli is diffused into the bloodstream, which contains a lower concentration of oxygen. Oxygen diffuses from higher concentration inside the alveoli to lower concentration in the blood. Each red blood cell contains hemoglobin, which is the substance that carries oxygen. Each hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen molecules. As the blood passes by the alveoli, it takes on oxygen. The PO2 of the blood increases, and oxygen increasingly binds to the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. As the blood travels through the lungs, the blood starts out at a low PO2 of about 40 millimeters mercury, and then increases its oxygen content, leaving with a PO2 of about 100 millimeters mercury. The oxygenated blood from the lungs travels through the circulatory system to supply oxygen-demanding cells of the body. In the systemic capillaries of the body, oxygen diffuses from the blood into the tissues. This occurs because the blood contains higher oxygen concentration, and the tissues contain lower oxygen concentration. Oxygen moves from a region of higher to lower concentration. The tissues use the oxygen for their dioxide levels are higher in the blood than in the alveolar airspace. Carbon dioxide tends to diffuse from the blood into the alveolar airspace. The bicarbonate is converted at the lungs to additional carbon dioxide, which also diffuses into the alveolar airspace. Finally, carbon dioxide molecules dissociate from hemoglobin, leave the red blood cells, and enter the alveolar space.
Okay, so the air we breathe in has a PO2, that's the partial pressure of oxygen, about 159, and a PCO2 of 0.3, so very low. Then in the lungs, it's going to mix with the air that's already in there, so by the time it gets to the alveoli, the air has a PO2 of 104 and a PCO2 of 40. And the blood in these pulmonary capillaries has a PO2 of 40 and a PCO2 of 46. So in the alveoli, oxygen is going to move into the blood. So you can see here oxygen moving into the blood, and the carbon dioxide moves out of the blood. And then by the time the blood leaves the lungs, it has a PO2 of 100 and a PCO2 of 40. And this diffusion happens very rapidly in about 0.25 seconds. So it's pretty amazing. Then this blood is going to travel to the left side of the heart and then go out to the systemic capillaries. So the fluid surrounding the body tissues has a PO2 of about 40 because it uses up the oxygen, and it has a PCO2 of 46, while the blood in these capillaries has a PO2 of 100 and a PCO2 of 40. So in the tissues, oxygen diffuses out of the blood and carbon dioxide diffuses into the blood. And then this blood is going to go to the right side of the heart and then go to the lungs and get more oxygen, and this process just repeats itself all day long, your whole life. The next thing we need to know are 3 factors necessary for oxygenation of blood. So first we need a pressure gradient between the oxygen in the alveolar air and the oxygen in the blood. So that means there has to be more oxygen in the air inside the lungs than in the blood. And so as long as we're breathing in oxygen, we have that. Then we need an adequate alveolar surface area, so you need your alveoli not to be destroyed. And because that's where gas exchange happens, is at the alveoli. And then you also need an adequate respiratory rate, so you have to continually breathe in more oxygen and breathe out the carbon dioxide. You can hold your breath for a little while, but not too long. Alright, next thing we need to know is how oxygen is transported in the blood. So most oxygen forms oxyhemoglobin. That means it's bound to the hemoglobin. And then that oxyhemoglobin travels to the cells. And then when it gets out to the tissues, the pH changes, and that helps break the bond between the oxygen and hemoglobin, and the oxygen is released to the tissues. So most of it is transported by hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide is transported in 3 ways. About 10% is dissolved in the plasma, about 20% is bound to hemoglobin, but the majority of it, 70%, is carried as bicarbonate ions. So that's one of the reasons that increasing carbon dioxide levels decrease the pH in the blood. So, final review question. The primary way oxygen is transported in the blood is... And correct answer is C, in the form of oxyhemoglobin.